Okay, so you know how sometimes you really want to get to the bottom of something? Like you're fascinated by a topic, but you don't want to get bogged down in a ton of research.
Oh, yeah, totally. I'm
Yeah,
like that all the time. There's so much information out there, it can be overwhelming.
exactly. And that's kind of what we do here. We take these huge research studies, these really in-depth analyses, and we distill them down to the most interesting and important takeaways. The stuff that really makes you think.
Like the stuff that surprises you.
Yeah.
The stuff that makes you go, huh, I never thought about it that way.
Yeah, exactly. And today we're diving into something that's becoming more and more prevalent in our lives, AI chatbots.
Oh, yeah, chatbots. Everyone's talking about them these days.
Right. They're everywhere. And we've got this really fascinating research study that looks at these psychological and social effects of using them.
It's not just like some small survey either. This is a serious study. 4 weeks long, randomized controlled, almost 1,000 participants. And get this, over 300,000 messages analyzed.
Wow, that's a lot of data. So this isn't just anecdotal, this is some real in-depth stuff.
Yeah, this is the real deal.
So you know chatbots, they're being used for all sorts of things now, right? Companionship, help with tasks, even just for fun.
Oh, yeah, totally. You can find a chatbot for pretty much anything these days.
And there was this initial hope that they could help with things like loneliness. But now people are starting to wonder if maybe they could lead to dependence or less interaction with real people.
Yeah, that's the big question, isn't it? Are chatbots ultimately good or bad for us?
And that's what the study really tries to get at. It's called the Randomized Controlled Study on Chatbot Psychosocial Effect. It was done by researchers at MIT and OpenAI, published March 21st, 2025.
It's a very recent research. Cutting edge stuff.
Okay, so before we get into the findings, let's talk about how this study actually worked. How do you even get almost 1,000 people to chat with AI for a whole month?
Right. Sounds like a logistical nightmare. Well, they were very clever about it. They took those 981 participants and randomly assigned them to one of 9 different groups.
9 different groups. Okay, so what were these groups all about?
So each group represented a different combination of 2 key factors. First was the way the chatbot communicated, like how it interacted with the user.
Okay, so like different communication styles for the AI.
Exactly. There were 3 options there. The first was just straight up text chat, typing back and forth.
Like the old school chat rooms.
Exactly. Then there was a neutral voice condition. Imagine like a very calm, professional voice, not a lot of emotion.
Okay, so like a digital assistant kind of voice.
Yeah, exactly. And then the third option was an engaging voice. This one was designed to be more expressive, more emotionally responsive, like a friendlier, more human-like voice.
Interesting. So they really wanted to see if the way the AI sounded made a difference.
Yeah, that was a big part of it.
Yeah.
And importantly, the voice conditions only involved voice interaction, so no typing involved there. And the text condition was purely typed, no voice at all.
Got it. So text, neutral voice, engaging voice. Okay, and what was the other factor? You said there were 2?
Right. The second factor was the type of conversation. What the participants actually talked about with the chatbot.
Okay, so the content of the conversation.
Exactly. And they had 3 options for this too. First was open-ended conversations. Participants could talk about whatever they wanted, no restrictions.
So just free-flowing chat.
Yeah. Second, they had non-personal conversations. Each day, participants were given a different topic to discuss, but it was always something impersonal, like historical events or scientific discoveries. Nothing too personal.
Okay, so keeping it factual.
Right. And then the third option was personal conversations. Each day, participants received a unique prompt designed for personal reflection, almost like journaling, but with a companion.
So really digging into their thoughts and feelings.
Exactly. And across all 9 of those conditions, participants were asked to interact with their assigned chatbot for at least 5 minutes every day.
5 minutes a day doesn't sound like a lot.
You'd be surprised how much can happen in 5 minutes, especially when you're interacting with something as sophisticated as these AI chatbots.
That's true. Okay, so after a month of all these chats, what happened? What did the researchers find?
Well, let's start with the overall trends. Across all 9 conditions, they found some pretty interesting things. First, they noticed that by the end of the 4 weeks, participants reported a significant decrease in loneliness.
So chatting with the AI made them feel less lonely.
On the surface, yes. But here's the catch. They also found a significant decrease in how much participants socialized with real people during those 4 weeks.
Oh, wow. So less interaction with actual humans.
Exactly. And there's another really important point here. The study didn't include a control group. That means a group of people who didn't use a chatbot at all. So it's tough to say for sure if these changes were directly caused by the chatbots.
Ah, I see what you mean. Could be other factors at play.
Right. It's possible that other things going on in the participants' lives during those 4 weeks contributed to these changes. We can't rule that out.
So it's a correlation, but not necessarily causation.
Exactly. Correlation doesn't equal causation. That's a key takeaway here.
Good point.
But there was one finding that was super clear. The more time people spend interacting with the AI each day, the more negative the outcomes tended to be.
So the more you chat with the AI, the worse it is for you.
Basically, yes. Higher daily usage was strongly associated with increased feelings of loneliness, greater emotional dependence on the AI, more problematic AI use.
Problematic AI use, what does that mean?
That refers to unhealthy patterns of engagement with the AI, like spending excessive amounts of time chatting with it, neglecting real-life responsibilities because of it, that sort of thing.
So it can become a bit of an addiction.
In some cases, yes. And of course, higher daily usage was also linked to less interaction with real people, as we just discussed.
Yeah, that makes sense. The more time you spend in the virtual world, the less time you have for the real world.
It's a balancing act for sure.
Okay, so let's talk about those different chatbot voices, the text, the neutral voice, and the engaging voice. Did they have different effects?
They did. Initially, both the neutral and engaging voice modes seemed to have more positive effects compared to text, at least in terms of loneliness, emotional dependence, and problematic use.
Really? So the voices were better than the text?
At first, yes.
Yeah.
But it's important to note that they statistically controlled for the amount of time people spent chatting. So they could isolate the effect of the voice itself separate from just the duration of use.
Okay, so it wasn't just that people were chatting for longer with the voice AI. It was something about the voice itself.
Exactly. And interestingly, the engaging voice, the one that was designed to be more emotionally responsive, actually showed a trend toward more socialization.
Wow, that's surprising. You'd think the more human-like voice would lead to more isolation.
You would think so, wouldn't you?
Yeah.
But it seems like initially, at least that wasn't the case.
But it's fascinating.
But here's where things get really interesting. Those initial benefits associated with the voice modes, especially the engaging voice, they seem to disappear when people use them for longer periods each day.
So there's like a tipping point, a certain amount of use where it flips from good to bad.
Precisely. And specifically, prolonged interaction with the neutral voice chatbot was linked to significantly less socialization with real people and higher problematic AI use compared to text.
So the neutral voice, the one that's supposed to be less engaging, actually ended up being more detrimental in the long run.
Exactly. It's quite a counterintuitive finding.
It is. Makes you wonder why that might be.
We'll get into some possible explanations later on, but first, let's address something you might be wondering. Did people tend to use the different modes for different lengths of time on average?
Yeah, that's a good question. Like, did they naturally gravitate towards one mode over the others?
Well, they did find that on average, participants spent more time interacting with the voice-based chatbots than with text.
So people were more drawn to the voices?
It seems that way. The average daily usage for text was 4.35 minutes. For neutral voice, it was 5.56 minutes. And for engaging voice, it was 6.16 minutes.
So yeah, people definitely spent more time chatting with the voices.
Which might explain why those negative effects became more pronounced with the neutral voice at higher usage levels.
It's like, the more you use it, the more it sucks you in. But the engaging voice didn't have that same effect.
Not to the same extent. It seems like there's something about that neutral voice that might be particularly conducive to problematic use. But we'll delve deeper into that later.
Okay, that's something to look forward to. Now, what about the content of the conversations? Did it matter whether people were talking about personal things or just sticking to facts?
Okay, so let's unpack this. At average usage levels, personal conversations were linked to higher feelings of loneliness compared to open-ended chats.
Really? That's surprising. You'd think sharing personal stuff would make you feel more connected, even if it's with an AI.
You would think so, wouldn't you?
Yeah.
But the researchers have a theory about this. They suggest that it might be because the AI, while it can simulate understanding, doesn't provide the same reciprocal emotional support you'd get from another person.
So it's like you're putting your heart out there, but you're not getting the same level of empathy back.
Yeah, that could be part of it. And this lack of true reciprocity might actually highlight the user's lack of real-world connections.
So it's like the AI is a mirror reflecting back your own loneliness.
In a way, yes. But here's the interesting thing. Personal conversations at average use also showed lower emotional dependence and problematic use compared to open-ended chats.
So less reliance on the AI and fewer unhealthy usage patterns.
Exactly. So it's a bit of a trade-off.
Yeah.
Maybe a slight increase in loneliness, but less dependence and problematic use.
Okay, interesting. So what about those non-personal conversations, the ones focused on factual topics?
Those were associated with greater emotional dependence at average usage levels.
So using the AI as a source of information can make you more reliant on it.
It seems that way. Perhaps because users start to depend on the AI for information and advice, it fosters a sense of need, like they can't function without it.
Like a digital crutch.
Yeah, that's a good way to put it.
Now, you mentioned before that these effects shifted with increased use, kind of like what we saw with the voice modes.
You're catching on. You're absolutely right. The initial benefits of personal conversations that lower dependence and problematic use, they diminished as people use them more frequently.
So the more you share with the AI, the less beneficial it becomes.
It seems so. And on the flip side, longer non-personal conversations, while having a less negative impact on socialization compared to open-ended chats, actually had a stronger negative impact on emotional dependence.
So the more you rely on the AI for information, the more attached you become.
Precisely. It reinforces that dependence.
Okay, that makes sense. Out of curiosity, what were the average daily durations for those different conversation types?
Good question. Open-ended conversations averaged 6.0, 2 minutes per day. Non-personal, 4.92 minutes. And personal, 5.12 minutes.
So people actually spent the most time with the open-ended format.
They did. It seems like having that freedom to chat about anything kept people more engaged.
Makes sense. So it looks like the type of conversation you have with the AI really matters. But it's not the only factor, right? I imagine individual differences play a role too.
Oh, absolutely. This isn't a one-size-fits-all situation.
Yeah.
Individual characteristics had a significant impact on how people were affected by the chatbots.
So like personality traits and stuff.
Exactly. For example, people who started the study with higher levels of loneliness, lower socialization, high emotional dependence, or high problematic use were more likely to have those same tendencies at the end.
So if you're already struggling with those issues, a chatbot might not be the best solution.
It might even exacerbate those issues in some cases. But it's important to note that those tendencies weren't always to the exact same degree.
Meaning they might have improved a bit?
It's possible. It could be due to a statistical phenomenon called regression to the mean.
Regression to the mean, what's that?
Basically, it means that people who start out at the extremes are likely to move a bit closer to the average over time, regardless of any intervention. So it's hard to say for sure whether the chatbots were solely responsible for those changes.
I see. So some of the improvement might have been natural.
Exactly. Or it could be due to ceiling effects on the scales they used.
Ceiling effects.
That means that if someone is already scoring very high on a particular measure, there's not much room for them to improve, even if the intervention is effective.
I get it. So it's tricky to tease apart those different influences.
It is. But regardless, it's clear that individual starting points matter.
Yeah, that makes sense. What other individual traits seem to be important?
Well, gender was one. Women in the study were more likely to experience less socialization with real people after the 4 weeks of chatbot interaction.
So women were more negatively affected in terms of their social lives.
In that specific aspect, yes.
Interesting. Any ideas why that might be?
It's hard to say for sure, but it's something worth exploring further.
Definitely. What else?
This was really interesting. They found that if the user and the AI voice had opposite genders, it was linked to more loneliness and greater emotional dependence on the AI.
So like a man interacting with a female AI voice or vice versa.
Exactly.
Huh. That's strange. You'd think it would be the other way around.
You'd think so, right. But it seems like there might be something about that opposite gender dynamic that fosters these negative outcomes.
Maybe it taps into some of our existing social patterns and expectations.
It's definitely a possibility. More research is needed to really understand what's going on there.
Okay, what other individual factors did they look at?
Well, age was another one. Older participants were more likely to become emotionally dependent on the chatbots.
So the older you are, the more susceptible you are to AI dependence.
It seems that way, yes.
Any thoughts on why that might be?
It could be related to factors like social isolation or cognitive decline. But again, more research is needed to say for sure.
Okay, makes sense. What else?
They also looked at attachment tendencies. People who scored higher on measures of attachment to others were more likely to become lonely after using the chatbots.
That's counterintuitive. You'd think people who are more comfortable with closeness would fare better.
You would think so, right?
Yeah.
But it could be that their need for connection wasn't being met by the AI, which actually amplified their feelings of loneliness.
Like the AI was a poor substitute for real human interaction.
Exactly.
Okay, what else?
They found that individuals who tended to avoid their own emotions were also more prone to increase loneliness after using the chatbots.
So people who have difficulty processing their feelings might be more vulnerable to the negative effects of AI interaction.
That seems to be the takeaway, yes.
Makes sense. So it really highlights the importance of emotional regulation and self-awareness when it comes to interacting with these technologies.
Absolutely. It's not just about the AI itself, it's about how we approach it and how we manage our own emotional responses.
Now, what about people's past experiences with chatbots? Did that make a difference?
It did. Participants who had prior experience using companion chatbots reported significantly higher levels of emotional dependence and problematic use with the AI in this study.
So like people who were already used to chatting with AI for companionship.
Exactly, like those who use platforms like Character.ai.
Yeah, I've heard of that. So it seems like those patterns of interaction might carry over to other types of AI.
That's what the findings suggest.
Makes sense. If you're used to treating an AI as a friend, you might fall into similar patterns even with a different AI.
It's all about the habits we develop.
Okay, so we've talked about individual traits and past experiences, but what about how people perceive the AI itself? Did that matter?
Oh, absolutely. That's a huge factor. How we think about these AI really shapes the impact they have. For example, those who saw the AI chatbot as a friend, they scored high on what the researchers called social attraction, actually reported lower socialization with real people and higher emotional dependence and problematic use.
So the more we humanize them, the worse it is for us.
It seems that way, yes. The more we see them as social partners, the more they might detract from our real-world connections.
It's like they're taking the place of real friends and family.
In a way, yes. And it's not just about friendship. Higher levels of trust in the AI were also associated with greater emotional dependence and problematic use.
So the more we trust the AI, the more we rely on it.
Precisely.
Yeah.
It's like we're putting all our eggs in one basket.
So it's important to maintain a healthy degree of skepticism.
Absolutely. Don't put all your faith in technology.
But it wasn't all negative perceptions, right? Were there any ways people perceived the AI that were linked to positive outcomes?
Yes, there were. Interestingly, when users perceive the AI as showing empathic concern, meaning it recognized and responded to their negative emotions, that was linked to higher socialization with humans.
So feeling understood by the AI, even though it's not a real person, actually led to more real-life interaction.
It seems that way. Maybe feeling understood even by an AI bolsters our confidence in connecting with others.
It's like a stepping stone to real human connection.
That's an interesting way to put it. And here's another positive perception. Participants who had higher affective empathy towards the AI, meaning they resonated with the AI's simulated emotions, reported less loneliness.
So feeling empathy for the AI actually made them feel less lonely.
Yes, this is quite a surprising finding.
It is. You'd think feeling empathy for a machine would make you feel more isolated, not less.
You'd think so, wouldn't you? But it seems like there might be something about that act of empathy itself that's beneficial.
Maybe it activates some of the same neural pathways that are involved in real human empathy.
That's a possibility. It's definitely an area that warrants further investigation.
Okay, so we've got this mix of positive and negative perceptions. Seeing the AI as a friend or trusting it too much seems to have downsides. But perceiving its empathy can be positive for real-world connection. And feeling our own empathy towards it might reduce loneliness. It's all very nuanced.
It is. This isn't a simple black and white issue. It's much more complex than that.
And here's something that really surprised me. You know how they had those different voice modes, the neutral voice and the engaging voice?
Yeah.
Well, you'd think the more anthropomorphic design, the one that makes the AI seem more human-like, would lead to more emotional engagement and maybe even worse psychosocial outcomes.
You would think so, right?
But that's not what they found. In fact, text interactions showed higher levels of emotional indicators and self-disclosure.
Yeah, that was a big surprise. It goes against a lot of our assumptions about how we interact with technology.
So people were actually more emotionally open and vulnerable when they were just typing back and forth?
That's what the data shows.
What do you think that is?
Well, when they analyzed the content of the conversations, they found that the text modality had the highest levels of emotional indicators in both user and model responses. Things like sharing problems, seeking support, using affectionate language.
So the text conversations were just more emotionally charged overall.
They were. And text interactions also had higher levels of self-disclosure from both sides. Both the users and the chatbot were more willing to share personal information.
That's really interesting. Why do you think text might be more conducive to self-disclosure than voice?
The researchers suggest that typing might feel more private than speaking, especially if people are using these chatbots in public spaces.
Like they don't want to be overheard talking to an AI.
Exactly. That perceived privacy could make people more comfortable disclosing personal information via text.
So it's like a digital confessional?
In a way, yes. And it's worth noting that the chatbot's level of self-disclosure in text was quite high. It almost mirrored the user's level of disclosure.
So the AI was opening up too?
It was. And that might have encouraged users to be more open themselves.
So it's like a reciprocal process.
Exactly. The more vulnerable the AI seemed, the more vulnerable the users were willing to be.
Now, what about those voice modalities? You mentioned before that the engaging voice was rated as happier, but did that translate to more emotional interaction?
Not really. While the engaging voice was indeed perceived as more positive, it didn't consistently elicit more emotional interactions than the neutral voice.
So the tone of the voice didn't seem to matter that much.
Not in terms of emotional depth, but it did seem to influence the types of conversations that took place. The engaging voice tended towards more casual small talk, the neutral voice towards advice and explanations, and text towards procedural guidance.
So the voice you choose might steer the conversation in different directions, but not necessarily towards deeper emotional connection.
Exactly. And when they looked at prosocial and socially improper behaviors in the chatbot responses, they found some really interesting differences. Text-based interactions actually came out ahead in terms of prosocial behavior.
Wait, so you're saying the text AI was more supportive than the voice AI?
In many ways, yes. Text-based interactions showed more empathy, offered more reminders for self-care and the value of human connections, and validated users' feelings more often than the voice modalities.
Wow, that's really counterintuitive.
It is. It highlights the difference between perceived warmth and actual supportive behavior. The engaging voice might sound friendly, but the text-based AI was actually more consistently supportive in its responses.
That's fascinating. So it's not just about how the AI sounds, it's about what it actually says and does.
Precisely. Actions speak louder than words, as they say.
So based on all these findings, the researchers identified 4 distinct interaction patterns.
They did. These patterns seem to be linked to different psychosocial outcomes.
Okay, I'm all ears. Tell me about these patterns.
The first pattern they called socially vulnerable. This pattern was characterized by high loneliness and low socialization. It was often seen in individuals who scored high on emotional avoidance and attachment tendencies.
So people who have difficulty with intimacy and emotional regulation.
Exactly. And they tended to view the AI as a friend, engage in personal conversations, seeking emotional support, and use the AI heavily. The AI in these interactions was also highly empathetic.
So it's like a vicious cycle. They're looking for connection in the wrong place, and the AI, while seemingly supportive, is actually reinforcing their isolation.
That's a good way to put it.
Okay, what's the next pattern?
This one is called technology dependent. It's marked by high emotional dependence and problematic use. This pattern was more common in people who had prior experience with companion chatbots, high trust in the AI, and a belief that the AI cared about their emotions.
So they're really invested in the AI.
They are, and their conversations tended to be non-personal, focused on seeking advice, and they involved high daily usage. The AI in these interactions maintained a more professional distance.
So it's not about friendship in this case, it's about utility.
Right. They're relying on the AI for information and guidance, and that reliance can become a problem.
Okay, what's the third pattern?
This one is called dispassionate. It's associated with low loneliness and high socialization. This pattern was more often seen in people who had positive attitudes towards AI, sometimes more men than women, and those who perceived the AI as empathetic. Their usage was low, their conversations varied but were mostly non-personal, and they didn't show strong emotional responses to the AI. The AI in these interactions also tended to be emotionally distant.
So they're using the AI in a more detached way.
Exactly.
Yeah.
It's a tool for them, not a companion.
And that seems to be protective against the negative effects.
It does. It suggests that maintaining a healthy distance from the AI can be beneficial.
Okay, and what's the final pattern?
The last one is called casual. This pattern is linked to low emotional dependence and low problematic use. It involved people with low prior chatbot, used low trust in the AI, and who didn't believe the AI was concerned about their emotions. Their conversations were relatively short, personal, but casual with low emotional disclosure. The AI in these interactions was also emotionally distant, but engaged in more small talk.
So it's like a lighthearted, friendly, but not too deep interaction?
Exactly. And it seems like that kind of interaction might be the sweet spot.
Avoiding the extremes of both emotional investment and emotional detachment.
Precisely. It's all about finding that balance.
Okay, so we've covered a lot of ground here, but before we wrap up, I want to acknowledge that no study is perfect. Every study has its limitations.
You're absolutely right. And the researchers themselves were very upfront about the limitations of this study.
So what were some of the things they pointed out?
Well, first of all, they didn't have a control group, as we discussed earlier.
Yeah.
So it's hard to say for sure that the observed changes were solely due to the AI.
Right. There could have been other factors at play.
Exactly. And they also didn't collect information about where and when people were using the chatbots.
So like what context they were using them in?
Right. We don't know if they were using them at home, at work, on the go, etc.
That could make a difference.
It could. And another limitation is the duration of the study. 4 weeks might not be long enough to capture longer-term effects.
So the negative effects might become more pronounced over time.
That's a possibility.
Yeah.
And the controlled nature of the interactions might not fully reflect how people use chatbots in the real world.
So it's a bit artificial.
It is. And the findings are specific to OpenAI's models and their safety guardrails.
So other AI systems might behave differently.
They might. And finally, their sample might not be representative of all potential user populations.
So we need to be careful about generalizing these findings too broadly.
Absolutely. These are all important caveats to keep in mind.
Okay, well, with all those limitations in mind, what are the key takeaways from this study? What's the big picture message?
I think the main takeaway is that AI chatbots can have both positive and negative effects on our well-being.
So it's not a simple good or bad situation.
Exactly. It's much more nuanced than that. And the effects seem to depend on a complex interplay of factors, including the design of the AI, the individual characteristics of the user, and the nature of the interaction itself.
So it's not just about the technology. It's about how we use it and how we relate to it.
Absolutely. And I think this study really highlights the need for more research in this area. We need to better understand how to design and use these technologies in a way that promotes well-being and doesn't undermine our social lives.
I agree. It's a fascinating and rapidly evolving field, and this study has given us a lot to think about.
It has. And I think it raises some really important questions for all of us. Like, how do we want to integrate AI into our lives? What are the boundaries we need to set? And how do we balance the potential benefits with the potential risks?
Big questions indeed. And questions that we'll continue to grapple with as AI becomes more and more integrated into our lives.
No doubt about it. This is just the beginning of the conversation.
It is, and it's a conversation that we need to have. So thank you for joining me on this deep dive. I hope you found it as thought-provoking as I did.
I did. It's been a pleasure.
And to our listeners, thank you for tuning in. We'll see you next time for another deep dive into the world of research and ideas.
Until then, keep those brains buzzing.
And remember, stay curious.